Thank you very much. Actually, I wonder if we could have the lights up a little bit, because I'm sort of speaking into complete sort of darkness here, and I'm not going to use any PowerPoint, and I can't see any of you. I'd just like to really thank the organisers very, very much for inviting me. It just looks like the most amazing conference. I really wanted to be here earlier, and I've been in Heathrow for hours, so I missed the session that was just before, and I'm sure there are lots of continuities and things I could have said had I been here for the algorithm session. So forgive me if I'm going over some things that you've already discussed. And thank you very much for that generous introduction, which summarised my argument so well. You know, it's going to be difficult to give it to you again. But anyway, I have just published this book called Press for Time on the acceleration of time in digital capitalism. And one of the key areas I look at in that book is, of course, the relationship between work life and the rest of life, and how the constant connectivity afforded us now by these digital technologies is shifting the temporality of these spheres. And that's really the theme I'm going to address this evening. I'll tell you a little bit about the book in a minute, but I really just wanted to start by revisiting the concepts of work and labour just for a moment, so that you've got them in your head before we go on to talk about digital labour. I mean, my background actually is as a sociologist of work and employment. That's what I've done for 30 years. And for me, work is done in time. Work is a temporal act. And for me, the employment contract was the main, you know, the clear concept that I always had, that the employment contract always represented the exchange of pay for the capacity to work over a specified period of time. I mean, the problem of management schools is simply the problem of how you get that labour to do anything during the time it's paid to be present. That is the only problem of management schools. Okay, so traditionally, the sociology of work, and when I started doing it in the 1970s, we basically were concerned with manual labour. That's what we thought about, and very much the concepts we used were Marxist concepts of exploitation and alienation. That's how we understood these things. And the two things I just want you to recall before we sort of start thinking about digital labour, I think, is the first one that's just been mentioned actually, is that with the rise of the factory system, what we had was a clear division between workplaces and the rest of our lives, that was one of the fundamental separations. And the employment contract very much separated my time from employers' time, and that was clear and that was distinct. And the other thing capitalism gave us, of course, was money, that the medium through which this exchange occurred, the labour contract, was through money. Okay, now with the rise of white-collar work and service work, which is, before the discussion about the information revolution as we have it now, we were actually thinking about, well, how do we now think about labour that's less physical and manual, that's more psychological and mental. And there were debates certainly within British and American writing on the sociology of work, trying to address these questions. And the concepts that we came up with at that time were ideas like emotional labour, affective labour, aesthetic labour. These were all concepts trying to deal with these new forms of work. And one popular writer at this time was Ali Hochschild, an American sociologist, and lots of people took up her distinction between emotional work and emotional labour, where she talked about how everyone does emotional work, but it's actually in the commercial sector, in the public sphere, that you have flight attendants and waitresses and lots of people in the service sector having to perform what she called emotional labour. And so she talked very early on, I think, about the commodification of feelings, a commercialisation of feelings. So I think that's worth keeping in mind as well. The other debate I think it's worth recalling from this earlier period is a very long debate about the nature of domestic unpaid labour. How could we start thinking about this? And actually, I spent some of the best years of my youth with Marxists debating whether housework was productive labour or unproductive labour or intangible labour, whether it produced a surplus or it didn't produce a surplus. But I think it's worth recalling these debates because I think there are some parallels with the way we're trying to now think about digital labour. Okay, so I've been interested for a very long time in how technology affects work and the related question of how we manage our time. You know, time for work, time for families, time for leisure, even time for sleep. We've been talking about this renewed interest, actually, in even, you know, in capitalism's encroachment of even the time of sleep and how we think about these things. And of course, digital technologies are very much transforming work, and they're transforming all these boundaries. And these things are key to the sort of things I try and talk about in my book. So I hope you don't mind, that's not quite the right word. I want to sort of tell you a bit about the book, just to give you a sense of where my head is, before I come back more specifically to the topic of digital labour right at the end. The reason I wrote the book is that I was really intrigued by the fact that everywhere I heard that life is speeding up, that the pace of life is accelerating. Everyone complains how busy they are, particularly in America, I have to say. Everyone's incredibly busy. Time is at a premium. And the other thing that is said the whole time, endlessly, is that the rate of technological innovation is also accelerating. Endlessly people quote Moore's law and just say, there's this inbuilt law that computers are going to get more powerful by the year, and that these two things are very much seen as causally linked, the pace of technological innovation and the pace of everyday life. And so I thought it was interesting to sort of think about this, to question this, as I think it's very much assumed and not questioned. Now, of course, if you're a cyber guru from Silicon Valley, you think this is all fantastic. You think this is great because this speed is going to make our lives better than it ever was before, more efficient, it's going to save us time, we're going to be able to do things faster, and what's more, we're going to be able to do things simultaneously. And whether it's the personal assistant, Siri on your iPhone or Cortana or any of these personal assistants, they're going to let us do lots of things while, the ads, while we're jogging along or we're doing other things. We can have emails and meetings and all of these things. And my point is that they'll free up time, that the technologies promise to free up time. And I think on the flip side, I'm very struck by what I think is now really an avalanche of popular books and newspaper articles bemoaning our current state of busyness and distraction. And the number of books on digital distraction are just enormous now. And the number of advice books on the new disease of digital addiction. How are we going to deal with it? The solution is to have a digital detox, lock up the machines, practice mindfulness, meditation, and somehow return to a more natural, less digitized state. Now, what's very interesting from my point of view as a sociologist is that I think this notion of acceleration is also a buzzword in contemporary social theory. And I think it's interesting that the tenor of a lot of the abstract social theory is similar in the sense that it really sees this new digital instantaneous time as somehow socially destructive. And the sort of concepts that you find in the literature are concepts like timeless time, instantaneous time, network time, a lot of talk about the annihilation of time. And I'm thinking here of theorists like Manuel Castells, John Urry in Britain, Paul Virilio, and I've read quite a lot of a German social theorist called Hartmut Rosa, who maybe you're more familiar with, who writes a lot about trying to theorize this new digital temporality. Now, I talk about these theorists at length in my book, and I obviously haven't got time to go into details here, but what I think is interesting is that all of them somehow agree that there's a demise of linear clock time, that the old industrial time is linear clock time, and we're moving to this new digital time of instantaneity, and what's driving this is digital technologies. Okay, now what I try and argue in the book at length is that actually I think this cultural imperative of speed is much more a cultural artefact than a technological one. I describe myself as somebody who works in science and technology studies, and I noticed just in the few minutes of the last panel that the perspective people are taking on technology now is to see technology as intrinsically social, that we don't anymore treat technologies as somehow these abstracted tools that are separate from us and that have good and bad effects. We somehow now much more think about technologies as making possible what we do, and even how we think about time. If you think of the history of clocks, actually, and how much we've internalized clock time and how clocks mediate our sense of linear time. In a sense, we couldn't have that experience of time if they weren't mediated through particular techniques, but it's not that the techniques produce this kind of time, it's that we, together with these technologies, produce these things. And in science and technology studies, we use metaphors like mutual shaping or co-constitution of people and things, and we think about technologies as frozen social relations, as crystallizations of social relations, very much trying to emphasize that we co-evolve with technologies rather than being driven by them. Now, the point of that is that I think once you take that kind of perspective, you see very clearly that all these narratives about everything accelerating, that we're living in this acceleration society, I think are terribly one-sided. And that if you think really about our everyday lives and how we experience temporality, I think we actually live a multiplicity of textures and temporalities in our everyday lives. And I think they depend very much, and they vary very much in intensity, depending on what we're doing, where we're doing, and with whom we're doing things. So given that context, given this differential and multiplicity of times, how can we then start thinking about what digital technologies are doing to labour and to time? Well, I think the first thing that needs to be said is that technological innovation always brings about, comes hand in hand with, new activities and experiences, new kinds of social relationships, and new ways of working and living. Now, it's true that we now spend an unprecedented amount of time with our machines, on our machines, and the British Regulation Authority brought out a report just a few weeks ago saying that British adults now spend more time watching TV, using their mobile and on the computer than they do sleeping. It was one of those headline things with a picture of snoozing and someone in bed with their machines, and this is an incredible new world. And I think this sort of data makes it very easy to assume that somehow the digital revolution is to blame for our feelings of the accelerated pace of time, stress at work, all of these things. I think it's very easy to blame technologies. And I think technologies are, of course, having an effect on our time and temporality. And I think they've very much affected the quality or character of time. But what I want to raise is whether it's necessarily made work more stressful. I think to say that it's changed the character of time is one thing. I think to say that it necessarily makes life and work more stressful is another thing. And again, what I would stress is that technologies don't have a life of their own. They only come to life as we integrate them into our lives, as we give them meaning. And what you find, if you look at the history of technology, always, is that technologies have unpredictable effects, they always have contradictory consequences. And there's loads of history showing us that people use technologies in very different ways than their designers meant them meant for them, to be used. And so I'd very much argue that the very same technologies that may on the one hand and in some contexts make us feel harried may also give us some capacity to taking more control of time. Let me just give you a couple of quick examples. I've done a lot of research for decades on the mobile phone. I started doing work on the mobile phone when the mobile phone was new. Probably not many of you can remember this, but I remember very well when it was new. I was a laggard. It took ages for me to get a mobile phone. And as an old Marxist, I just thought, these phones are just going to intensify work. They're a terrible capitalist tool. And I absolutely bought the line that mobile phones were going to colonise, meant that work would colonise all of time, end of story. Yep. And I ended up doing a big research project on this for various completely serendipity reasons. And what I found, which is obvious now, but really wasn't obvious when they were new, was that here was something that was designed as a business tool that people quickly used to contact family and friends. I absolutely started the study thinking most of the mobile use will be work use. I found that most of it was contacting family and friends. We all know that smartphones have similarly, Blackberries were designed as a business tool, but people have used them in very different ways. And one of the ways they've used them, and I talk about this quite a lot in the book, is that I think they've become very important tools for synchronizing activities in a desynchronized society. And what I mean by that is that if you think back to the 1950s, or at least the ideal of the 1950s, you had a society where people were collectively working and doing and shopping and doing things at more or less the same time. There was more or less predictable times. People came home from work and watched the BBC News at 7 o'clock. And what we've had with what's called the flexibilisation of the labour market, 24/7 shopping, dual earner families, is that there's far fewer collective routines, that people are doing things much more at different times, and that coordinating, even with family members, has become much more difficult. And so when I think about why has the phone become so ubiquitous, for me, it's because it's because of the way we work and live. We're living in a way where actually being on the bus or the train and saying, I'm on the way home, which seems like a completely useless thing to say. And, when I first started working on this, journalists would just say to me, oh, I hate it when people do that. I'm on the train, I'm on the, But actually, these are very important activities, I think, for synchronizing things. And I think the mobile phone has been a fantastic tool in that context. And I would say similar things, actually, about email. I think there's a lot written about and thought about what's now called information overload, that email is killing us. And there's a fantastic study by some colleagues of mine at Stanford University, where they very much argue that emails have actually somehow become symbolic of work stress. That because emails accumulate in the inbox at the end of the day, because they're easy to see, it's become much easier to complain about having too many emails than to complain about too many meetings, too much work, too much pressure at work, loads of things. And I think the fact that we feel that we need to reply to emails quickly is not to do with the technical capacity of email, that it's incredibly instantaneous. It's to do with collective norms that have built up about what's the appropriate response time. And actually, when I'm not in Germany, so, I'm scared to do this sort of here, I always quote, Daimler and the various examples of German car firms that have introduced the email ban at weekends and various other practices to try and change the culture of the 24/7 availability, actually, to try and shift this cultural norm about instant response. Now, emails are a new form of work, and they make work in one sense, but I think they also transform what work is, how it's done, and the boundary between work and other aspects of our lives. And indeed, many of us use email during the workday for personal communication. And the conversation has always been about how work is shifting to home, but I think there's very little research and thought about the fact that actually a lot of personal communication and a lot of sort of emotional work, support, all of these sort of things are going on via these technologies, mediated by these technologies during the working day, and that's an important aspect of this blurring of the boundaries, if you like, between work and other aspects of life. Okay, so just to my sort of last section quickly. I said at the outset that a distinctive feature of capitalism was a very clear distinction between work and other aspects of life, and that digital technologies are now muddying a lot of these distinctions and making it much harder to distinguish between work and leisure and between production and consumption. And social media in particular, and I know this is our topic for today, are making it much harder to think about what labour is and how we experience labour. And I think in a way it's relatively easy to think about all the user content that people are putting on the web and how this content is monetized, if you like. I think there's quite a lot of political economy now talking about the fact that, you know, when you go on Amazon and on various of these things, there's tracking data. I know it will have been talked about a lot in the session before, and that these things are monetized. And I think that's clear, and in that sense, you can consider value being produced and work being produced, although the activity mightn't feel like that, so that actually what's leisure is also labour and vice versa. I think what's less visible is the free cultural and technical labour that drives innovation on the internet. And here I'm very indebted and delighted to be on the same panel as Tiziana Terranova, because I've always used her work for a very long time to think about this sort of free labour that's simultaneously voluntarily given and unwaged, enjoyed and exploited. And the way she talks about, and I'm sure will talk about, how a lot of this work is simply motivated by the desire for pleasurable cultural production. And I was very struck, I think it was last week, that Facebook has now launched a new product called Facebook at Work. I don't know if any of you have read about this. It's Facebook for the office. They're moving into the office. And the wrap in the advertisement for this is, I think, is interesting because it's about how the division between communication and information is actually a relic of the old technologies of the telephone on the one hand and the typewriter on the other, and how these things are now merging, that work is changing, and that Facebook is going to be the new kind of software that can do this job. I think this is kind of very interesting what they're trying to get at here. Now, as I'm sure you know, some companies are already doing versions of this where they're trying to merge people's personal media presence with corporate presence. And I think from the little bit of research that's been done on this already, what seems to be clear is that there's quite a lot of resistance on the part of employees to doing this because they very much experience it as a form of labour, as an additional job. I mean, I have to say that this will probably show what a old-fashioned person I am, actually, because I don't blog and I don't tweet. But when I just brought this book out with Chicago Press, it's the first book I've published when the press said to me, now you have to start blogging and tweeting, like all this extra stuff to promote the book. And I did just think, I haven't done this, and I did just think, well, this is a whole nother job. I thought this was your job, whole new forms of labour. So I think all of these developments really do confound the dynamics and when and where we work and play. And I just want to end by referring to a couple of things I think are maybe get less attention before we go into a general discussion. It seems to me that this debate about digital labour is essentially a debate about how we spend our time. That's really what it's about. But I think that sometimes it still does rather risk glamorising some of this digital labour as being creative labour. And it seems to me that it misses quite a lot of other forms of labour that are necessary, that aren't creative or interesting or enjoyable. And in science and technology studies, we very much try and focus on what we call infrastructure studies, where we're trying to heighten the awareness, not only of wires and tubes and cables, the materiality of the so-called virtual, but also the invisible and time-consuming labour that underpins our electronic world. I mean, think about the time it takes to keep our digital infrastructure working at home. The time it takes to be upgrading endlessly the bloody software, you know, buying these new machines, putting stuff on the machines, all this stuff that's never discussed as, you know, cutting edge Silicon Valley. And I think what this, I think one of the reasons for this is that I think the temporal story of technology is all about the early moments of inception, the heroic inventors. And it's not about breakdowns, maintenance, fixing. It's not about all that quiet repair and maintenance work that's needed to keep this electronic world going. And I think these are forms of digital labour, and they're paid and unpaid. You get people in to help you. You do a hell of a lot of it yourself. I think they're forms of labour that are very rarely discussed. I also think that we need to be very careful about widening the concept of labour, because I have very clear memories of the domestic labour debate and how we ended up widening and widening and widening the concept so that even sex was, you know, unpaid sex, was a form of labour. And I think we need to retain a sense, you know, we've got to have some working definitions of what labour is and what isn't labour is. And I think this raises the issue, and I sort of want to end just by raising these issues, about really what we want technology to deliver through automation. What do we want technology to automate? And what are the things that we really want to leave outside the commodity form, outside of the market? And I quite often end with the example of these new automated nurse bots that are being designed in in Japan, to look after old people. I don't know if you've seen any pictures of these nurse bots that are the height of artificial intelligence, but they're designed to look like perfect young, beautiful Japanese women, and they're presented as the most futuristic robotics, and yet to me they very much reproduce old, stale stereotypes, and they raise issues about, do we want this labour of care automated, or do we want some of this labour actually to be left out of the market, to not be accelerated? Now, I just want to end by saying that I'm not at all, people sometimes accuse me of being anti-technology, and I'm not nostalgic for a less digital world at all. I'm not, I mean, even though I've written a book on speed, I'm not in the slow food movement or the deceleration movement or any of these movements. I mean, if you look these things up on the net now, there seems to be a slow science movement, a slow reading movement, just endless slow movements. I'm a great fan of Donna Haraway's, and Donna Haraway has a great line about how she's really enthusiastic about the emancipatory potential of technology to create new meanings and new worlds, but at the same time wants to be the chief critic, and that's the sort of position I like to take up. And I think when we think about digital labour and time, we're really thinking about the quality of life. What sort of life do we want to have? And I think the issue with time, and I talk about this as discretionary time or sovereignty over time, I think the issue with time in doing these activities is really how much autonomy we have over our time. That an element that there's a book I love called Discretionary Time, A New Measure of Freedom, where the people who wrote it try and say that actually having free time and discretionary time is a really important element of freedom, of what we think freedom is, as having a decent amount of leisure time. And I think really that's the issue that comes up again and again with this notion of what is free labour and what isn't, and what we want to do with our time and how much control we have over our own time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Judy, for redistributing also the agency of capturing and calculation away from the media, digital media, towards the users, towards the kind of wider assemblages in which it's embedded, and also for reminding us of a further measure in which labor is being turned into not only into data but also eventually into time.